Raise your hand if you, oh, I see one.
Just a minute, I'm.
I will come at your disposal, Sandra. You tell me when you're ready. And I will just stand here until, thank you, sir. I am trying, Diane.
Sandra, I have your bones in the car, don't forget. Hello.
Goodness gracious.
Okay, and before we go on the air,
It's too late.
words, can't say it.
Is it vulgar? Yeah, is it something?
Well, you can say.
Okay.
Okay, so, prayer requests. Do we have any prayer requests this morning? Cheryl Abernathy, yes ma'am, her on the list.
Kelly,
Kelly and Debbie. Did Kelly get to come home?
No, he got delayed. He's really disappointed. Should be sometime this coming week.
Okay. Any other prayer requests? Gail Reno,
Michelle,
Michelle Ray,
Nan's traveling today through the storm.
Bruce is having a test tomorrow.
All right, Bruce Harris had a test on Monday.
Keep Miss Mary on there. We saw Robin Friday night and said Mary was just not feeling
She is at home, she is at home.
well. But she was Friday,
Yeah.
yeah. But she won't let anybody stay with her at night, but they're staying with her during the day.
But today's her day on the prayer calendar, so remember Mary especially today. Bonnie?
And Kate, it's test, heart cath is tomorrow, not
Yeah, Brother Bob's dad, heart cath tomorrow.
And Karen has been referred to Nashville, is that right?
Yes.
You know when that appointment is?
I don't think they had it.
Oh, they were working on it, but they did not have it all set up. Any other prayer requests? Hannah will be traveling this week as well.
the story that we
Storm victims,
Debbie Stewart,
Debbie Stewart.
Nancy's daughter.
Bless you. Annabelle, will you open this, please?
Lord, we thank you for this day. Lord, we ask you this morning to open up the eyes of our heart, Lord, that we just might abide in your word as we learn as we live our social lesson this morning. Give us new insights. Bless us, Lord, with the mighty power of your word, Holy Spirit. Lord, we also ask you to be in these situations that we've brought up, illnesses and difficult situations and, Lord, emotional upset. You know all there is, and we just ask you to wrap your arms around each person, and those that we have not reached, in Jesus' name.
So I've already heard some commentary about today's lesson, about it being maybe a little lacking in some content. And okay, so what we have is an event that occurs in between what I would consider more well-known events, maybe more well-studied events. This is sort of a smaller piece of the puzzle, but I believe it's an intricate piece of this puzzle of the kingdom going from Saul's hands to David's. So I think this little piece of Jonathan and taking over this outpost on the top of this ravine, I believe it's a very important piece of the puzzle, but it's surrounded by much more popular, much more well-studied, much more familiar sections of Scripture. So what occurs in chapter 13 in 1 Samuel before this? One of the things we studied not too long ago about his daddy, Saul.
He offered a sacrifice to the Lord instead of waiting for the priest.
Right. Instead of waiting for Samuel, and Samuel said, hold up, I'll be there in 7 days. Let's back up a little bit. Saul had whipped, well, not Saul, Jonathan had whipped the Philistines. Whipped them good. Took them and just wore them out. I mean, we would say it was a good whipping. And Saul took credit for it. Let's go back to chapter 13 for just a second. I want to, well, is it all in chapter 13? Where is that? Yes, chapter 13, verse 3. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it, and Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear, that all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines. Saul just took credit on Father's Day. Saul just took credit for the victory that his son, God through his son had granted Israel. Saul has defeated this garrison, but no, it was Jonathan that had done that. Jonathan had won this big battle through the power of God, and now Saul was taking credit for it. And the response of the Philistines was to gather everybody together. And they said there were so many of their troops and their armed forces that they looked like sand of the sea when they came out after Israel. So after this big victory, everybody should be happy. Saul takes credit. The Philistines get mad. They assemble their army. And Israel does what? Israel trembles and goes to hide. They're hiding from this big army. And I like how it says it here. For the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, were in a tight spot. Who knows what that movie was? Right there. Oh, brother, where art thou? Thank you, Patsy. We're in a tight spot. For the people were distressed, and the people did hide themselves in caves, and in thickets, and in rocks, and in high places, and in pits. They hid. They hid. That kind of comes back to our lesson today. We'll talk about it in just a minute. But they hid from the Philistines. God had just granted them this huge victory with Jonathan and a smaller force than was with Saul. And they're overwhelmed by the numbers. Now, that's going to be another important part of today's lesson, right? Numbers. So when we talk about numbers and advantage, in the military, numbers are an advantage, right? Wouldn't we say in modern military warfare? Robert, you're the most attached to that right now. Numbers do matter, right? The technological advances of the armed force matter, right? What we're going to find out is the Philistines had made sure that the Israelites had no ironworkers, no blacksmiths. So without blacksmiths, the Israelites were having to sharpen their farming tools and to use bronze tools. Bronze fails when put up against iron. In and of itself, iron's going to win every time. There was the Bronze Age, easy to work with, didn't take a whole lot of technological know-how to make bronze tools and implements. The Iron Age comes, and these guys are doing stuff with iron that's never been done before, making steel so strong that it can't hardly be broken. That can be sharpened to a point where it just razor sharp. Goes up against bronze, it wins. That's where the Israelites find themselves in today's lesson, is that they're up against an army with a lot more people and a lot nicer weapons.
And 30,000 chariots.
And chariots, oh yeah, mobile army.
I take it Israel had no chariots because God had told them not to put their trust in horses
Or chariots. Yep. All that's going to come back to us here in just a minute. So, looking at it from the outside, Israel was overmatched, right? This army was technologically, numerically, every advantage the Philistines had, Israel didn't, so they hide. So as they're hiding, Saul gets upset, Saul gets nervous, Saul sees this disadvantage and decides to take matters into his own hands by offering the sacrifice that Samuel was supposed to do to God. As soon as the sacrifice is made, Samuel shows up. What have you done? Saul, remember we studied this, I don't know, just a few months ago. Saul says, I forced myself and offered a burnt offering. I had to do it. I felt it was right. And Samuel's response to that is, well, you didn't have faith. You didn't wait. You can't trust in God, and we can't trust you to trust. So the kingdom will be taken away from you. So that's the instance there where we see Saul is finally getting punished for his actions, and the kingdom's going to go to somebody else. So, after that happens, Israel's still in hiding. We've got Saul's army that's ill-equipped to handle the Philistines. And Jonathan is the opposite of Saul. And that's what we're going to read about in this part of the lesson, is that he sees God as being the most powerful advantage you can have. It's not the weapons, it's not the manpower, it's God. So they're waiting, Saul's got his army, and it's kind of neat that we're going to read here in the lesson that Saul is sitting underneath a tree. This is a pomegranate tree. When we get to that point, I want you to think what it meant for them to say that. What it meant for somebody to be sitting underneath their tree. The prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah, mostly Jeremiah, I think, talk about in the future how every man will sit underneath this fig tree and how his garden will produce all the foods that he needs. It's a sign of peace and rest that you're able to sit underneath your tree. Saul is sitting underneath his tree, and it's not a time of rest. It is a time of war. So Saul's misbehavior continues even through today's lesson, just that short section. So, let's read the first couple of verses there, 1 through 5, and we'll get the geography of what's going on. A volunteer, please.
Now it came to pass on a day that Jonathan the son of Saul said unto the young man who bare his armor, Come, and let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. But he told not his father. And Saul tarried in the uttermost part of Gilboa under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. And the people that were with him were about 600 men. And Ahiah, the son of Ichabod's brother, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest, and Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people knew not that Jonathan was gone. And between the passages by which Jonathan sought to go over into the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock on the one side and a sharp rock on the other side. And the name of the one was Moses, and the name of the other was Sina. The forefront of the one was situated northward, over against Mishmash, and the other southward, over against Gilboa.
All right, so as you volunteered for that, just so you know. I wasn't going to assign that to anybody. I wanted to volunteer. So,
Notice how well
well, thank you for biting the bullet and doing that one for us. A lot of fun there. So, Jonathan, do we think Jonathan acted rashly here? What do we think about Jonathan deciding to go to this garrison, this fort, this advanced position of the Philistines? What do we think about him?
We know what happened, so we got to assume that was fake. But at this point, it looks kind of foolhardy.
It does, doesn't it? Now, why wouldn't he tell his dad?
Things aren't going well for that.
Things aren't going real well for Dad, right? Dad has just had the kingdom removed from him. Dad's had a lot of bad things happen, and Dad's kind of starting to lose his mind. And I mean this, I don't mean it in not literally a mental health way, but Saul is acting in ways that a military leader wouldn't. And that's what's indicated in verse 2. That he's laid up against that tree. You know, Uncle Kenneth used to go whittle against, underneath the tree in the front yard. And that was a sign of, that's what everybody what I would like to do when I'm retired is to have my tree and my knife and sit out there. That's a sign of rest and of peace. Peace is the right word there. Well, Saul was.
Wasn't peaceful.
It wasn't peaceful. He was acting in a way totally opposite of what you would want your commander-in-chief to be doing when you have this 30, how many thousand Philistines at your door watching you. It's the opposite of what you would want to do. So Jonathan takes a pretty smart move here and goes, let's go see what they've got. They're watching us. Let's go see what it is. Let's go see what's going on. So he takes the closest person to him, the armor bearer. Now, what was the job of the armor bearer? That's pretty self-explanatory, wasn't it? A little more than that, but yes, that was why he was given that name. What was he carrying?
Extra stuff.
Extra stuff.
The armor.
The armor. Robert.
He was one tough dude if he climbed those mountains with that armor.
If you look,
There were often warriors in training.
yes. Squires, if you would think about them as ones that followed the knights. In the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, this was kind of the person that would follow the knight, wanting to be a knight in training, and he'd be the one that would make sure the horse was ready, would make sure that all the knives and swords were sharpened. They were the ones that were in charge of all of that stuff.
And I think it's someone that Jonathan trusted too. He was
Absolutely.
a friend, I think, as much as a former bear. Maybe not a friend, but someone he could rely on.
If you're going into battle, say you're a paratrooper. Let's go with airborne paratroopers. The guy that packs your parachute, you gotta trust, right? You want them to be the very best parachute packer in the world, because when you jump out of that plane, it's on them, right? So you have to trust them. If you're going to, and again, we're going to use military ideas. If you're going to the armory and you're going to go get your firearm from the armory, you want that firearm to be oiled and ready and work perfectly, right? So you got to have faith in that person that's doing that. Saul had that same, or Jonathan had that same kind of faith in his armor bearer. His stuff had to be ready, had to be ready for use, had to be available. He had to be with him. So this guy was not just a servant, but he was a trusted person, someone that you trust with your life, literally with your life. So, and we see that that's both ways in this case, that these guys both trusted each other. So he didn't tell Saul, and he takes off. And there's a little aside there in verse 3 about the order of priesthood there. So the priests were with Saul at that location in Migron, whatever. And it gives us the idea that the priestly folks are there. They're the ones that are offering the sacrifices. They were traveling with the army. They were with Saul. Why were they traveling with the army? Because that's what they did. The ark went with them. The priests went there. There wasn't a holy city yet that the next king would establish. So the ark was, and all the religious stuff was following the king around.
The lesson gave the impression, I never thought about it before. They were going to make the mistake of leaving Saul without a priesthood.
That's a very good point. Saul's done walked into that one time already and did nothing but get them all in trouble. So, good point. So now we have the geography. And we're given a very specific location where the Philistines had set up their outpost. So it's on the sides of it. There's a ravine. It's on one side of the ravine. The Israelites are on the other. And it's so well known that even the sides of the ravine are named. Do we name weird locations today? What? Monkey's eyebrow is whatever this named after the curve in the river, whatever.
Dead Man's Curve.
That's the one I went to first thing when I read it was Dead Man's Curve. Why is it named Dead Man's Curve? Because it is. Yeah, it's pretty obvious there too, isn't it? It's because people lost their life on that curve. So these places were so formidable that they were given names as well, and people would know exactly, oh gosh, they're going to have to go, they're going over there. So even later on, generations later, they would be able to point out and say, oh, that's where that was. We still talk about Bull Run and Shiloh and Gettysburg, Vicksburg, these big battles in the Civil War where you can see the geography of those areas. The picket fence in Gettysburg, where all the people rushed up the hillside and died. We know that. It's been given a name. It's got a history. Same thing about these locations here. So, we got the geography, we got the background, and now let's see how Jonathan talks to his armor bearer right here. I think this is to me the heart of the lesson. Verses 6 through 10. No hard words in here, by the way.
And Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, Come and let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for there's no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. And his armor bearer said unto him, Do all that is in thine heart, turn thee, behold, I am with thee according to thy heart. Then said Jonathan, Behold, we will pass over under these men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. If they say thus to us, Tarry until we come to you, then we will stand in our place, and will not go up unto them. But if they say thus, Come up unto us, then we will go up, for the Lord hath delivered them into our hand, and this shall be a sign unto us.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabe. So, Saul gives a command or instruction. Jonathan gives a command or instruction to his armor bearer. Lets him know exactly what they're going to do. And what word does he use to describe the Philistines here? Uncircumcised. There were parts of the lesson that kind of pointed out that was a derogatory term with regards to the difference between them and Israel. They were pagans, right? That's really what they meant, is that they didn't believe in Jehovah, God. And that those that follow Jehovah have a set of rules that they follow, they believe, and God has made them promises. The circumcision was a sign of those promises, right? So I believe that Jonathan was pretty well read in Scripture. And I want to point you to Leviticus. So if you would, I think this is kind of interesting here. I believe it ties directly in. Leviticus chapter 26. It's not in the lesson text today, but I think it's very applicable to our lesson. Leviticus chapter 26. Moses on Mount Sinai is given all of these promises that God has spoken. He's telling them to the children of Israel. And in chapter 26, he's going over, again, many of the things that he'd already had written down. Verse 3 says, If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, then after verse 3 is a long list of things God's going to do. Let's look at verse 3 again. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, then God is going to fulfill his end of the promise, this end of the covenant, with all of these things. I will give you rain in season. The land shall yield her increase. I'm not going to read all of those. Verse 6, I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none shall make you afraid. What had happened when Saul didn't follow God's statutes? They got to trembling and got afraid and went and hid in holes and in crevices and on tops of mountains and in the bottom of pits. They hid from those things. Verse 7, And ye shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. And 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight, and your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. So what was not going to happen with Saul now? Those things. Because Saul did not follow the statutes and the commands of God. But we're going to see that Jonathan is just the opposite, and he does. So Jonathan gets to live out those verses from Leviticus that Moses had told them hundreds of years before.
And it was a gift from God.
Yes, it was a fulfillment of the promise
Yeah.
that God had said, that I will do this. This isn't even you having to do. All you have to do is keep my commandments. And then I will cause them to do this. I will give peace. I will give you rain. I will take care of all of that. So Jonathan remembers that. So,
And there were other, according to the lesson, notice there are other instances in here also.
Absolutely, absolutely. This was just one where, I mean, we had talked last week about Gideon. That had already happened hundreds of years ago. Jonathan knew that Gideon took 300 men and wiped out tons of Midianites. Jonathan had known that. Jonathan had seen that. And what's going to happen in the next generation? We're going to have David taking on the Philistines again, and God's going to win that battle as well. God's going to use David to fight a giant. So the odds when God's on your side are always in your favor. So, Jonathan comes up with a scheme, or does God give him some sort of knowledge here about how the Philistines are going to react?
Well, again, an if then.
It is an if then. So, I'm kind of at a, I don't know, I'm not sure. Did God give this scenario to Jonathan, or did Jonathan put God to the test with this? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure that it matters in the long run, because God was in it. God was in it the whole time because Jonathan was faithful.
But it says God may work with us. It doesn't say he will.
He did. I love it. And that's a really good, on page 35, the first paragraph, his use of may does not indicate doubt in God's ability, but rather shows a mature faith that avoids presumption. It reminds me of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Our God can deliver us out of this fiery furnace, but even if He doesn't, we ain't bound down to your idol. That was the faith, right? My faith is that God can. It's up to Him if He will or not. So Jonathan has that same kind of reaction there, right? So, the last sentence there in that paragraph on 35. He may have felt confidence that the Lord had put the idea in his heart, but he was leaving room for God's will to be done as he saw fit. I love that. God may have given me this idea. Haven't we all had that? You know, God gave me. And that was a great idea. But you know what, God? If that's not your idea, you let it go however you want. I'm not going to be disappointed either way. Man, that's a good idea. Let's go with it. So Jonathan goes with it. And the idea is they're going to crawl down one wall of this crevice and get to the bottom, and they're going to say, hello, we're down here. Make ourselves known, is what it says. They're going to make themselves known to the Philistines after going down one wall. Hey, we're down here. And depending on what the Philistines did, whether they said, oh, hold on, we're going to be right there, or y'all come on up, that was going to be the sign on whether God had delivered the Philistines into Jonathan's hand. Yeah, hey, we got something we want to show you. We haven't got there yet, but I think that's so funny. Oh, yes. Okay, so that's where we are. If they say, come up to us, we'll go up, for the Lord has delivered them in our hands. Now, it says that if they were to come down, Jonathan and his armor bearer, doesn't say they were going to run. They just said they weren't sure God had delivered them if that's the case. So they may have had to fight, they may have had to run, but that was the sign of God not giving them the garrison. All right, so let's look at the end of the lesson. Annabelle's already hit on it, one of my favorite lines in the whole thing. Let's read 11 through 13.
So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden. Then the men of the garrison called to Jonathan and his armor-bearer and said, come up to us, and we will show you something. Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel. And Jonathan climbed up on his hands and knees with his armor-bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan. And as he came after him, his armor-bearer killed them.
Oh, that's so great. So, they get down to the bottom. They make themselves known by whatever way, whatever, we're here. And the men of the garrison said, hey, y'all come up here. Well, let's get before that. Behold, the Hebrews have come forth out of the holes where they had hid themselves. As far as the Philistines were concerned, the Hebrews were still hiding from them. Just what we read a little while ago in chapter 13. All of Israel saw thousands of troops had left him. He had 6,000 troops with him. They were all gone. He was down to 600 at this pomegranate tree. So they had all gone into their holes, into their hills and their pits and whatever. The Philistines knew it. They knew they had the advantage because of fear. They had them shaking in their boots. So with that fear, and surprise, look, these two guys have popped out of their holes. These two guys that were in hiding have shown up. Now, the advantage of being on the high ground versus being down in the middle of this very tight, narrow crevice is pretty obvious, right? The high ground has the advantage. You get down in the hole and then you are at the mercy of those folks that have the higher ground. They can shoot at you, they can trap you in, they can throw things at you. You're in the bottom there. So what do the Philistines not do? They don't put themselves in that position to be trapped in that. It would be a trap for them to go down. It'd be stupid for them to go down. So they call them up. Hey, we got something to show you. Now that's pretty funny, right? You know they're being sarcastic. They're in a state of war. This is not some, hey, we want to show you guys something. We got a present for you up here. This isn't them trying to be nice. This is, yeah, we're going to kill you, so come on up. Come on up. Go ahead, Ronnie. You had something.
I just had a thought, but I've never thought of it before. Did the Philistines and the Hebrews speak the same language? How did they talk to each other?
What was the question?
He said, how did they speak the same language?
Oh,
We know later on that the Philistines, when Goliath is coming out, they understand everything, all of his taunts and everything. So maybe the languages were similar enough that they were understandable.
What's that called? They're all based, well, what's the Jewish language based on and stuff?
That group of people from Canaan, that area was called the Levant.
Yeah, but there's
yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Look for the S.
Semitic.
So, yeah, it's a Semitic language.
Semitic
Yeah.
languages.
Yeah. So I'm sure they were all close enough with variants. Even the French and Spanish can understand each other because their languages are all Italian. They're all from Rome. It's a Roman language, Romance language. Yeah. They call them romantic. I think that's kind of cool. They're really, I'm not sure Spanish is considered
Tone
romantic.
of their voice, but
And-
the message across.
And I'm sure you can tell a lot by somebody's tone. Yeah. And you can communicate a lot with just a few words or gestures. Or
Maybe you didn't understand every word because I can't do this. We'll show you a thing.
yeah. Hey, we got a thing. Yeah. Hey, we got something we got for you. We got something for you upstairs. Come on. I can imagine how much of a taunt that was. So whether or not they could actually literally understand it, but they got the gist of it, I think that's pretty obvious. And we know that when the taunt comes from Goliath, all of Israel hears it and understands it. So I don't think language was a barrier, but I could see how it could be. So they answered Jonathan, and Jonathan sees that as what? What is that response to him? Yes, it's a confirmation that God is in the middle of this. God's got this, right? God just did what he said he was going to do. Let's roll. Let's go do this. Let's go take care of it. Come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel. That's what Jonathan said. That's what he said to his armor bearer. It's a done deal. We got it. So, him and the armor bearer climb up on their hands and knees, their feet. This is a steep climb. How vulnerable are you when you're trying to climb up a hill and using both your hands and your legs and feet to get up there? What are you not holding?
Your weapon.
Your weapons, your armor, your battle gear. It's on your back and it's tied onto you. You're dragging it up behind you. You are absolutely vulnerable. Boy, that takes an act of faith, doesn't it? I think that is not given enough credit in the lesson, that for them to make themselves completely vulnerable to this people that have the high ground. Man, what does that tell us about us? That we should trust God like Jonathan? To make ourselves so vulnerable that it has to be God that protects us? Think about that for a minute. Just think about the situations that we can find ourselves, and we try to take credit for our protection, our own well-being. Jonathan and his armor bearer got rid of all of it. They became completely vulnerable just so that God could fulfill his promises.
And all of them thought they could take care of 2 men by themselves.
Oh, what's a threat to, to 20 people, 2 men? I'll take those odds any day, right?
If they hadn't thought they could, they would have picked them off.
That's right. All right, who knows the movie or the book, The Princess Bride? So, the cliff of insanity, right? You've got the man in black climbing up the cliff, and what are the guys on the top of the cliff doing? They're waiting for him to come up. They even offer him a rope because they see that they're going to defeat this guy. No problem. It's taken from this right here. They wait at the top of that cliff for that guy to come up, and they lose. Just like Jonathan and his armor bearer defeat the Philistines. So, Jonathan knocks them down. Verse 13 says, and Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and upon his feet, his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan. And Jessica's version of the New King James says the armor bearer came up behind him and was putting them down. Jonathan was knocking them to the ground. His armor bearer was making sure they were dead along the way. How cool of an example is that? So, that's where our lesson ends. But it's not where the story ends, because it gets more important. So not only does God give Jonathan a victory over 20 people in this garrison, what happens in verse 14 and 15? Not in our text today, but I think it's very important. So if you've got your Bible, look at verse 14. What does Jonathan do here? We get the details. And that first slaughter, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, was about 20 men within, as it were, a half acre of land, which a yoke of oxen might plow. So they considered the size of ground about how much an oxen could till in a day. So this amount of ground was half of what a team of oxen could break up in a day. So they covered that much ground and killed at least or about 20 people. Now look at verse 15. That kind of victory brings results. So someone read verse 15 and 16.
And there was trembling in the camp in the field and among all the people. The garrison and the raiders also trembled, and the earth quaked, so that it was a very great trembling. Now the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and there was the multitude melting away, and they were here and there.
So not only did Jonathan and his armor bearer beat this group of 20 people, there were people that were watching and hearing, and they saw it, and they got afraid. And there was an earthquake. Did Jonathan cause the earthquake? No. Did Jonathan cause the fear and the trembling? No. Did Jonathan cause the army of the Philistines to fight against each other and to melt away? No. The lesson left all of that out. The most important part, it's a really important part. Jonathan had to have faith. He had to go do this act with his armor bearer. But it's what led the way for a greater victory by God himself, that no one had any hand in except God. The fear, the trembling, the earthquake, causing the army to fight against itself and to run away, that's all God. Jonathan was faithful. Jonathan had courage to do what he believed God had given him the call to do, and then God did the rest of the work himself. And for whatever reason, the lesson decided to leave that very important thing.
Some of the extra parts in the back addressed it, but I thought it was weird that they didn't include those verses in the lesson itself. In the heart of the lesson, at the very bottom, it says, Jonathan's courageous act encouraged Saul's army to pursue the fleeing Philistines after God caused the Philistine army to panic. But they didn't tell us that in the lesson.
And it gets worse with Saul, right?
Yeah.
In the rest of chapter 14, Saul gets stupid. He's a terrible general at this point. Like I said earlier, thank you, loses his mind. He says, now that we've got the Philistines on the run, keep chasing them and don't eat anything. Don't eat, just keep chasing them. Don't stop to take a break to eat anything. This is all part of this story. While these Philistines are all discombobulated and they're on the run, Saul says, hey, don't eat nothing, just keep going after them. And the people are getting tired and weak, and the Philistines are surviving. Hey, Charlie! Hey, Ella. So, the rest of the story is that Saul does more silly stuff. Jonathan has some honey, feels good. It's like, what kind of foolishness is this? If people would have had honey or some food, they could have gone and just wiped them out just like that. So Saul really is showing how his lack of faith in God and his taking matters into his own hand is foolish, and how Jonathan, the opposite, is allowing God to work through and in him, which is just beautiful. Any other thoughts on the lesson today? There is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. Don't let numbers bother you.
Verse 23, so the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth Haven.
The Lord saved Israel that day. So when you feel outnumbered, whether it's in an election or anything else, when numbers seem to matter, God on your side makes you the majority. Don't forget that. Any other thoughts before we close? Patsy? Any other thoughts? Why don't you dismiss us in a word of prayer?
Lord, we just thank you for the privilege we have of coming and studying your word, Lord. And we just ask that you would help us this week to know that we can do something to help your cause, Lord. We always think that there should be a group, but we alone